Okay, on our next test, you're going to have a family tree, and on the family tree will be definitions for most of the important characters. So as you take notes, leave some space and write definitions for each of these people. Some of them you may have already read about, and so you might want to go back to some previous quizzes and add some more details for some of these characters. We begin our family tree with Abraham, and he's a rather singular figure in the Bible. Unlike basically everybody else, Moses, David, St. Peter, everybody else, Abraham is a very, very strong figure. And the story that I want to start with to illustrate this comes from Genesis 22. And there's a quiz on Genesis 22 and 23. But in the story of the testing of Abraham, God calls him to sacrifice his son Isaac, his miracle child. And I want to actually pull up the older translation that we used to use. The New American Bible went through a revision, and I love the way that this one began. Sometime after these events, God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, "Abraham!" "Ready," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, Isaac, your only one, to a place that I will show you, and I will sacrifice him." But I want to focus on that word ready, especially with the exclamation point. Abraham, unlike everybody else in the Bible or in the world, is ready. God says, "I want you to move hundreds of miles to follow a God nobody's heard of." Ready, he does it. Your 90-year-old wife is going to have a baby. Ready. I want you to do a little elective surgery on yourself and your teenage son. Ready. I want you to take your son and sacrifice him. Ready. And Abraham is the only character in the Bible who really has this strong, ultimate faith in God. It's almost a little bit frightening. And the normal story of Abraham sacrificing his son kind of implies that God messes with us, that God asks us to do things that God really doesn't want us to do, and then at the end says, "Oops, psych, didn't mean for you to kill your kid." And I just want to put out there that the story of Abraham sacrificing his son might be easier to understand if we realize that he moves from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan to follow this God that no one's ever heard of. And in the land of Canaan, one of the rituals, or some of the religions of that time, actually involved child sacrifice. And the greatest gift to give to one of these gods would be a son, or a male child, or even a firstborn son. So if I were to look at the story in a historical context, is it possible that at some point Abraham perceived that if he wanted to show God his faithfulness, he should sacrifice his son? And then God had to intervene and say, no, I don't want that. I don't want human sacrifice. It's possible that there might have been some sort of historical kernel underneath that. Obviously, for Christians, the idea of a father willing to sacrifice a son has a lot of power for us as we look at the story of Jesus as God's son coming and being sacrificed. But the story has its problems, but the purpose of the story is to emphasize how faithful Abraham is. You should have some notes already on who Sarah is. If not, fill that in, leave some space. And you should have some notes on who Hagar is and why she's important. You should have something down about Ishmael, especially the idea that Ishmael is the ancestor of the Arab people or Muslim people, the Islamic faith, whereas Christians and Jews trace their ancestry through Sarah and Isaac. You should have completed already, and I'm going to suggest that you leave over on this side of the page a little bit of space to write some definitions later on. We're going to follow the family tree down this side, but there's 2 vocab words I will throw in there for convenience. The story of Isaac and his wife Rebekah and their twins Esau and Jacob. Again, write some details about who Isaac is. He's the one who gets tricked by his son. He's the one who almost gets sacrificed by his father. Doesn't come across as a particularly strong character. Esau and Jacob are two very different twins, and the story of Esau and Jacob kind of highlights a theme that comes up in many stories in Genesis. Just as the barren wife who gives birth to a miracle child is repeated over and over again in the Bible, in the story of Hannah, in the story of Samson. Another theme that comes up in the Old Testament a lot is the theme of the younger son overcoming the older son. So second son Isaac replacing Ishmael, or the younger twin Jacob triumphing over his older brother Esau, is a theme that comes up over and over because the Israelites saw themselves as the underdog, as the younger son. There's all these big empires like the Egyptians and Assyrians and the Greeks and the Romans. And little Israel always saw itself as the younger brother who is going to overpower the more powerful first son. Jacob is going to have his name changed to Israel, and you should write down what that means. It's in a footnote in, I believe, chapter 27. Jacob is going to have two wives, Leah and Rachel. He's going to go on a journey to find a wife. He's going to fall in love with Rachel, the beautiful younger daughter of his uncle, and he's going to be tricked into marrying Leah, the older daughter, on his wedding night. He's going to work 7 years to earn Rachel as a bride, because this is a culture that regarded women as property, and you would earn her and be paid as giving her wife. And then he ends up getting tricked into marrying Leah and has to work another 7 years to get Rachel, and then he gets both wives. Jacob's family is going to consist of 12 sons and possibly many daughters, but only one is actually mentioned. And those 12 sons are going to become the namesake for the 12 tribes of Israel. Just as if George and Martha Washington had a daughter named Virginia and a daughter named Mary and a son named Delaware and a son named York, the stories of the patriarchs in Genesis have the 12 tribes being named after the 12 sons of Jacob. Out of all those sons, the hero in the story, again following with that theme of the younger brother, is not any of the oldest sons, but the firstborn son of the favored wife, Joseph. And Joseph is going to save his family from a famine, and that's a story that you will cover in a separate quiz. So a theme that comes up again in the Old Testament is the idea of the well. When Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac, he meets her at the well. When Jacob goes to the old country back to Mesopotamia to find a wife, he meets her at the well. Later in the story of Moses, he is going to meet his wife at a well. And then for Christians in the New Testament, there's a story of Jesus from the Gospel of John, where Jesus meets a woman at the well and has an encounter with her, doesn't marry her, but it builds on this Old Testament theme of meeting the woman at the well. The vocab word that I want you to know, speaking of themes, Sarah is suffering from barren wife syndrome, gives birth to Isaac, a miracle baby. Rebecca is suffering from barren wife syndrome. She gives birth to twins, Esau and Jacob. Rachel, Leah is fertile and has lots of children. Rachel tries to catch up with a concubine, but then Leah gets a concubine and has more children. And finally, Rachel, the barren wife, gives birth to the miracle child, and that miracle child is Joseph. So again, this idea that certain themes, kind of like in fairy tales, the beautiful young girl who had a wicked stepmother, or on TV, the many, many, many comedies where the doofus dad is integral to the story. We have these kinds of structures that appear in the Old Testament where there's certain themes that are repeated over and over and over again. So get rid of these barren wife. Okay, the two vocab words I mentioned to you, patriarchs and matriarchs. If you're taking Spanish, you might see the Spanish words padre y madre in there. A patriarch is a forefather or literally father ruler. And the patriarchs of the Old Testament are the forefathers of the Jewish people, or in the case of Muslims, Ishmael and Abraham are their forefathers. And the matriarchs are the mothers of their nations, Sarah and Rachel and Leah and Rebecca. And I want to talk briefly about the United States. We have Betsy Ross, who makes the flag, and we have George Washington, our first president, or we have people like Abraham Lincoln, or people like maybe Rosa Parks, if we want to go more modern, who we see as Americans as the mothers and fathers of our country, the people who helped shape our country into who we are. And by learning those stories and by transmitting those stories, we create our identity as Americans. We talk about Honest Abe Lincoln, and we talk about George Washington as a person of integrity. And these create our identity as Americans. They're part of our mythology. And the same thing in the Old Testament, where the stories of Abraham, the faithful father, or Jacob, the younger brother who supplants the older, these kinds of themes are creating the identity of the people of Israel. And again, for Christians, we see ourselves as part of that covenant as well, that they create our identity as Christians. In class, I would like to talk about some of these characters, and I would like you in your notes to jot down who you think some of these people are. And if you're really, really good, maybe jot down all of them. I will tell you this one over in the right-hand corner. This is Pecos Bill, P-E-C-O-S. And curious if any of you know what he's famous for. There is some foreshadowing in the picture to tell you what Pecos Bill is known for. But in the upper left-hand corner, we have a woman manning a cannon, and maybe look at the hats on the people in the background as a clue. Below that, we have a man with a hammer on his shoulder and a train in the background. Center top, we have a man wearing a metal pot on his head. And below that, somebody in a plaid shirt. In the upper right-hand corner, again, a train theme down there on the bottom. And if you would take a guess, you could obviously cheat, and I don't care if you do, but for the sake of fun, write down who you think these people are in your notes, and you're going to take a picture of your notes and submit it, and take a guess at who they are and what they are famous for, and we will talk about them in a future class. That does it for us.